The first light of an autumn morning rested gently upon the rolling English hills as Eleanor Hart watched the carriage wind its way along a narrow country road lined with ancient oaks whose golden leaves drifted lazily across the damp earth like quiet blessings. She had never traveled so far from the village where she had spent the greater part of her life, and although uncertainty accompanied every mile, she carried herself with calm dignity. Her late father had always believed that kindness and patience were treasures greater than wealth, and those simple lessons had become her constant companions after his passing. When the carriage finally reached the tall iron gates of Ashwood Hall, she folded her gloved hands together and whispered a silent hope that this unfamiliar place might become more than merely a place of employment. The manor rose from the mist with graceful stone walls covered in ivy and windows that reflected the pale sky like polished silver. It possessed neither the proud brilliance of a royal palace nor the cold severity of a fortress, but instead offered the quiet beauty of a home that had witnessed generations of laughter and sorrow. A servant welcomed Eleanor with respectful courtesy before leading her through spacious corridors scented with beeswax, polished wood, and faint traces of lavender. Portraits of forgotten ancestors watched peacefully from the walls while every clock seemed to measure time with deliberate gentleness. She soon met the children entrusted to her care, who greeted her with shy curiosity and careful manners learned from years of disciplined upbringing. Their smiles appeared only after a few encouraging words, and she sensed how greatly they longed for warmth within the ordered rhythm of the household. It was not until the evening that she was introduced to the master of the estate, Mr. Henry Ashcroft. He entered the library carrying a single book beneath his arm and paused beside the glowing fireplace whose gentle flames painted soft amber light across the room. His expression remained composed, yet his eyes revealed the quiet weariness of a man who had carried invisible burdens for far too long. He welcomed Eleanor with sincere politeness and thanked her for accepting the position before returning his attention to the fire, as though its comforting glow offered answers that conversation could not. Eleanor noticed that despite the grandeur surrounding him, loneliness lingered in every thoughtful silence. Outside, the wind whispered through the ancient trees, while inside, the steady crackling of burning logs filled the room with peaceful warmth. As the house settled into the stillness of night, Eleanor gazed into the dancing flames and wondered whether every great home guarded not only its cherished memories but also gentle hopes, waiting patiently to awaken once again. The days at Ashwood Hall soon settled into a peaceful rhythm that seemed to follow the gentle movement of the seasons themselves. Every morning, Eleanor greeted the children with a warm smile before lessons began beside the tall windows, where soft sunlight streamed across polished wooden floors. Reading became their favorite hour because she never hurried through the pages of a story but allowed every adventure and every quiet conversation to bloom naturally in their imaginations. When the weather remained fair, they wandered through the gardens where roses climbed ancient stone walls and small birds gathered among carefully trimmed hedges. Eleanor encouraged the children to notice every tiny wonder that often escaped busy eyes, including the fragrance of herbs carried by the breeze, the delicate patterns of fallen leaves, and the cheerful songs of robins. Welcoming another calm afternoon, the servants soon spoke kindly of the new governess, whose gentle voice never disturbed the peaceful order of the household, yet somehow made every room feel brighter than before. Even the elderly housekeeper, who had seen many seasons pass beneath the old roof, admitted to herself that laughter had quietly returned to the nursery after far too many silent years. Mr. Henry Ashcroft rarely interrupted the lessons, but from time to time he paused outside the library or crossed the gardens at just the right moment to observe the children, smiling with an ease that had almost been forgotten. He never lingered long enough to attract attention, yet Eleanor occasionally sensed his thoughtful presence before he disappeared once more into the duties that occupied his days. During supper, they exchanged only a few polite words concerning the progress of the children or the approaching arrival of winter, yet every conversation seemed a little easier than the last. Henry found himself listening with genuine interest whenever Eleanor described a favorite book or recalled a simple memory from her childhood because her words carried a quiet sincerity that expected nothing in return. One evening, rain began to fall, with a gentle, steady whisper against the windows while the fire glowed warmly. Inside the library, Eleanor entered to return several volumes to the shelves and discovered Henry seated beside the hearth reading without haste. He looked up with a faint smile and invited her to warm herself by the fire before the long walk upstairs. They spoke of poetry, ancient forests, and the comforting sound of rain upon old rooftops, until the silence between their sentences became as pleasant as the conversation itself. Neither of them noticed how late the hour had grown because the peaceful crackling of the fire seemed to wrap the room in a quiet world, apart from everything, beyond the walls of Ashwood Hall. When Eleanor finally wished him good night, she carried with her the comforting feeling that perhaps the lonely house had begun to awaken, not through grand events, but through small acts of kindness shared one calm evening at a time. The first frost of the season arrived quietly during the night, leaving every branch, every garden path, and every distant field covered with delicate crystals that shimmered beneath the pale morning sun. Ashwood Hall seemed wrapped in peaceful silence, as though the entire estate had paused to admire the gentle beauty of winter before another busy day began. Eleanor stood beside the nursery window with the children, watching tiny birds hop across the snowy lawn in search of scattered seeds, while soft curls of smoke drifted from the chimneys into the clear sky. She suggested that they spend the coming weeks preparing a modest Christmas celebration, not with extravagant decorations, but with handmade ornaments, thoughtful letters, and simple songs that would fill the old house with warmth. The children welcomed the idea with bright, eager smiles, and soon every lesson included a little time for careful drawing, graceful handwriting, or the folding of colored paper into delicate stars. Their cheerful conversations echoed through rooms that had long been accustomed to quiet footsteps and respectful whispers. The servants noticed the pleasant change, and more than once gentle laughter traveled along the corridors like music carried upon the winter air. Mr. Henry Ashcroft continued to devote many hours to the responsibilities of the estate, yet he often discovered reasons to pass by the schoolroom or pause at the doorway of the library, where Eleanor read stories aloud with calm expression and patient grace. He admired the effortless way she encouraged curiosity without demanding perfection, and how every child seemed to believe that learning itself could become a joyful adventure. One snowy evening, the wind swept softly around the ancient walls while the fire burned steadily within the library, casting golden light across shelves filled with well-loved books. Eleanor arrived carrying a collection of poems that she intended to read before retiring for the night, and found Henry quietly arranging fresh logs upon the hearth. He welcomed her with an easy smile that appeared more natural than ever before, and invited her to remain for a little while if she did not mind the peaceful company. Together they shared passages from favorite authors, speaking not as employer and governess, but as two thoughtful souls who found comfort in gentle words and familiar stories. Outside the window, snowflakes drifted slowly through the darkness, while inside the comforting glow of the fire softened every shadow upon the walls. There were moments when neither of them spoke at all, because silence itself had become a pleasant companion requiring no explanation. As Eleanor finally climbed the grand staircase carrying a single candle before her, she realized that Ashwood Hall no longer felt like an unfamiliar house. It had begun to resemble the kind of home where weary hearts could slowly heal through kindness, quiet evenings, and the simple blessing of being understood without the need for many words. Christmas approached with gentle certainty, and each passing day seemed wrapped in a quiet sense of expectation. The halls of Ashwood Hall were filled with the fresh fragrance of evergreen branches gathered from the nearby woods, while polished candles waited patiently to be lit on Christmas Eve. Eleanor guided the children as they carefully tied ribbons around wreaths and folded delicate paper ornaments that sparkled softly whenever the winter sunlight reached them through the tall windows. Nothing about the decorations was extravagant, yet every corner of the old house seemed brighter because each ornament had been made with thoughtful hands and joyful hearts. The servants smiled as they passed through the corridors carrying baskets of fragrant oranges, warm bread, and fragrant spices whose comforting aroma drifted gently from the busy kitchens. Even the oldest members of the household remarked that the manor had not felt so welcoming in many years. Henry observed these quiet changes with growing gratitude, although he spoke little of his feelings. More than once he found himself standing, unnoticed, at the doorway of the drawing room, listening to the children rehearse simple Christmas carols while Eleanor accompanied them with calm encouragement and patient kindness. Their voices rose gently toward the high ceilings and filled every silent corner with peaceful harmony. One afternoon, a heavy snowfall covered the garden so completely that lessons were set aside in favor of building snow figures and following winding footprints across the untouched white lawns. Henry unexpectedly joined the children outside, and before long, quiet laughter escaped him as one of the younger boys placed a crooked scarf around a snowman with great seriousness. Eleanor noticed that the sadness which usually rested behind his thoughtful eyes seemed lighter beneath the pale winter sky. That evening, the family gathered before the great fireplace after supper, where glowing flames reflected warmly upon polished wood and crystal glass. The children presented their handmade gifts with shy pride, and Henry accepted each one as though it were a priceless treasure. When Eleanor offered him a small leather bookmark embroidered with a simple pattern of oak leaves, she explained that it reminded her of the ancient trees surrounding the estate and of the strength they quietly carried through every changing season. Henry looked at the thoughtful gift for a long moment before thanking her with a sincerity that needed no elaborate words. He confessed softly that it had been many years since Christmas had brought him genuine comfort, and that this evening felt different in a way he could scarcely explain. Eleanor answered only with a gentle smile, knowing that some feelings were best left undisturbed, like glowing embers resting peacefully beneath the logs of a well-tended fire. As snow continued to fall beyond the windows and the last carol faded into comfortable silence, Ashwood Hall seemed no longer like a house burdened by old memories, but like a home where hope had quietly returned one peaceful winter evening at a time. The quiet days that followed Christmas carried a peaceful stillness that settled gently over Ashwood Hall, like the soft blanket of snow resting upon the surrounding fields. The excitement of the holiday gradually faded into comforting routine, yet the warmth it had awakened remained within every room of the old manor. Each morning Eleanor resumed her lessons with the children, whose confidence had grown remarkably since her arrival. They no longer approached their books with hesitation, but with eager curiosity, delighting in every new poem, every map of distant lands, and every tale of noble courage and quiet compassion. Henry often noticed how their cheerful voices echoed through the corridors, where silence had once lingered for far too many hours. He found himself pausing to listen before continuing toward his study, feeling unexpectedly grateful for sounds that had become part of the life of his home. During the afternoons, Eleanor frequently walked through the winter gardens wrapped in a warm woolen cloak, while the children searched for the tiny footprints of rabbits and birds pressed into the fresh snow. The bare branches of ancient trees stretched peacefully toward the pale sky, and every breath of crisp air seemed wonderfully pure. Henry occasionally joined these gentle walks, explaining the history of the estate and sharing stories told by his grandfather about the families who had cared for the surrounding lands through generations of changing seasons. Eleanor listened with sincere interest and discovered that beneath his reserved manner lived a thoughtful man who valued loyalty, kindness, and quiet duty above all else. Their conversations never hurried, and neither felt the need to impress the other with cleverness, because simple honesty was more comforting than grand speeches. When evening arrived, the familiar library welcomed them with glowing firelight and the rich fragrance of old, leather-bound books. Eleanor often selected a volume of poetry, while Henry preferred histories and collections of thoughtful essays, yet they enjoyed reading together in peaceful silence before exchanging gentle reflections upon whatever passages had touched their hearts. Sometimes the children would sit nearby, coloring small pictures, until sleepiness overcame them and a servant quietly carried them upstairs. Those tranquil evenings became the favorite part of the day for everyone within the household. Henry gradually realized that he no longer looked forward merely to the comfort of the fire or the quietness of the library, but to the simple certainty that Eleanor would soon enter the room carrying a book and offering her calm smile. Eleanor herself began to notice that whenever Henry was delayed by business, the house felt strangely incomplete. Despite the familiar surroundings, she gently reminded herself that she had come only to fulfill her duties, yet she could not deny the growing comfort she found in his thoughtful company. Outside, the wind wandered softly across the sleeping countryside, while inside the steady flames continued their quiet dance upon the hearth, and without either of them speaking the words, both hearts slowly began to understand that true affection often arrives not with great excitement, but with countless peaceful evenings shared beside a welcoming fire. The long winter gradually surrendered to the quiet promise of spring as gentle rains softened the frozen earth and the first green shoots appeared beneath the ancient hedgerows surrounding Ashwood Hall. Every morning seemed a little brighter than the one before, and the gardens slowly awakened from their peaceful sleep with delicate snowdrops, pale crocuses, and the earliest daffodils opening their faces toward the growing warmth of the sun. Eleanor welcomed the changing season with quiet delight, encouraging the children to keep small journals describing every flower, every bird, and every subtle change they noticed during their walks across the estate. They eagerly compared their observations, laughing softly whenever one discovered a blossom before the others or heard the cheerful song of a returning blackbird hidden among the budding branches. Henry often accompanied these gentle excursions whenever his responsibilities allowed, and he found unexpected comfort in watching the children explore the familiar paths with innocent wonder. Eleanor possessed a remarkable gift for revealing beauty in the simplest moments, and through her calm eyes even places he had known since childhood seemed wonderfully new once again. One afternoon they wandered toward a small stone bridge crossing a narrow stream whose clear water reflected the pale blue sky between gently swaying willows. The children skipped ahead, collecting smooth pebbles, while Eleanor paused to admire tiny white blossoms growing along the bank. Henry stood beside her for several quiet moments, listening to the peaceful murmur of flowing water before admitting that he had rarely taken the time to notice such small treasures in recent years. Eleanor answered that life often whispered its greatest joys instead of announcing them, and that only patient hearts learned how to hear them. Her gentle words lingered with him long after they returned to the manor. As evening settled across the countryside, the familiar library welcomed them with its comforting glow and the pleasant fragrance of burning oak logs. Rain tapped softly against the windows while Eleanor mended one of the children's favorite storybooks, whose worn binding had begun to loosen from years of loving hands. Henry watched her careful work with quiet admiration, noticing the tenderness with which she treated even the smallest things entrusted to her care. It seemed to him that wherever Eleanor directed her attention, something fragile became stronger and something lonely became cherished. He wondered whether the same quiet kindness had already begun to mend the hidden corners of his own heart without either of them fully realizing it. Eleanor sensed his thoughtful gaze only briefly before returning her attention to the book, yet a gentle warmth settled within her that had nothing to do with the welcoming fire beside them. Neither spoke of the quiet affection slowly growing between them because it felt too precious to disturb with hurried words. Instead, they allowed the peaceful evening to unfold naturally, while outside the first stars appeared above the awakening gardens, and inside Ashwood Hall another calm day came gently to its close, with hope resting silently beside the fire. Spring unfolded gracefully across the countryside until every meadow surrounding Ashwood Hall shimmered with fresh green grass and clusters of wild flowers gently moving beneath the mild afternoon breeze. The air carried the sweet fragrance of blossoming apple trees, while cheerful swallows returned to build their nests beneath the old stone eaves, exactly as they had done every year for generations. Eleanor suggested that the children spend one bright afternoon outdoors with their lessons, and together they prepared a simple picnic of warm bread, fresh buttersweet strawberries preserved from the previous summer, and fragrant tea poured into polished silver flasks. Blankets were spread beneath the broad branches of an ancient oak whose generous shade offered a peaceful refuge from the gentle sunshine. The children read stories, aloud, took turns sketching the distant hills, and laughed happily whenever butterflies drifted across their pages as though curious to join the lesson themselves. Henry arrived later than expected after finishing several matters concerning the tenants of the estate, yet the children greeted him with such enthusiasm that he gladly accepted their invitation to remain. He watched Eleanor speaking with quiet patience, encouraging every child to share their thoughts without fear of making mistakes, and he realized that the confidence now shining in their faces had grown from the steady kindness she offered each day, without expecting praise. As the afternoon slowly faded, the children wandered toward a nearby meadow, searching for wildflowers, leaving Eleanor and Henry sitting beneath the old oak where birdsong filled the comfortable silence between them. For a long while neither hurried to speak, because the peaceful moment itself felt complete. At last Henry quietly admitted that before Eleanor arrived he had believed happiness belonged only to distant memories. After losing his beloved wife several years earlier, he had devoted himself entirely to duty, believing that affection would only bring further sorrow if he ever allowed it to return. The great house had become orderly but empty, and every evening seemed longer than the one before. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression gentle and full of understanding. She told him that grief never truly disappeared, but sometimes it slowly learned to make room beside gratitude, and that remembering someone with love did not prevent the heart from finding hope again. Henry looked toward the bright horizon where soft clouds drifted lazily across the endless sky, and for the first time he spoke of his memories without the weight of unbearable sadness. It felt as though an old door long kept closed had quietly opened to fresh spring air. When the children returned, carrying armfuls of colorful blossoms, they found both adults smiling with a peaceful ease that had not existed before. As they walked home together beneath the golden light of the setting sun, Ashwood Hall appeared in the distance, surrounded by blooming gardens and singing birds, and Eleanor felt that the house itself seemed to breathe more freely, as though every gentle conversation, every shared silence, and every small act of kindness had slowly filled its ancient walls with new life once again. The gentle weeks of late spring passed with quiet grace, and every sunrise seemed to bring another small blessing to Ashwood Hall. Roses climbed higher along the old stone walls, filling the gardens with delicate fragrance, while the orchard shimmered beneath countless blossoms that drifted softly through the warm afternoon air like pale pink snow. Eleanor often led the children beneath those flowering trees where they read stories upon woven blankets spread across the fresh grass. Bees hummed lazily among the blossoms, and the distant song of a skylark floated across the open fields until even the youngest child would fall silent simply to listen. Henry found himself joining these peaceful afternoons whenever his work allowed, and little by little the boundaries that had once separated employer and governess became gentler, though never forgotten. Their conversations wandered easily from books to music, from childhood memories to quiet dreams that neither had spoken aloud for many years. Eleanor confessed that she had once imagined living in a small cottage surrounded by flowers, where every window overlooked green hills, and every evening ended beside a warm fire with a good book resting in her hands. Henry smiled softly and admitted that such a life sounded far richer than the grandest house, without kindness to fill it. His words lingered in Eleanor's thoughts long after the conversation had ended. The children soon noticed the peaceful understanding that had grown between the two adults, and they often exchanged knowing smiles, although their innocent hearts saw nothing improper in the quiet affection they witnessed. To them it simply seemed natural that two lonely people should brighten one another's days. One evening after supper, the household gathered upon the wide terrace to admire the sunset, spreading gentle shades of gold and rose across the distant countryside. The warm breeze carried the scent of blooming lavender, while swallows circled above the rooftops before returning to their nests beneath the eaves. Eleanor remained behind after the children had gone inside and stood quietly beside the stone balustrade, watching the last light disappear beyond the hills. Henry joined her, without speaking for several moments, until he gently remarked that Ashwood Hall no longer felt like a silent monument to the past, but like a place where tomorrow could finally be welcomed without fear. Eleanor lowered her eyes with a quiet smile and answered that homes were never truly restored by stone or timber, but by the people who chose to fill them with patience, compassion, and hope. Their hands rested only a few inches apart upon the cool stone, and although neither reached for the other, both sensed how close their hearts had quietly become. Inside the manor, the fire had already been lit, despite the mild evening, and its familiar glow welcomed them back into the peaceful library where books, candles, and gentle silence awaited. Neither of them could know that, beyond the calm rhythm of these tranquil days, the first faint shadows of misunderstanding were already beginning to gather far beyond the gates of Ashwood Hall, waiting patiently for the moment when their peaceful world would finally be tested. Summer arrived with long golden evenings and peaceful mornings wrapped in birdsong. Yet a subtle change settled over Ashwood Hall when news came that Lady Beatrice Waverley would spend several weeks at the estate. She had been a close friend of Henry's late wife and had visited the manor many times in earlier years, though her appearances had become less frequent. After the long season of mourning, the servants prepared the finest guest chamber, while fresh flowers were arranged throughout the house, and every detail reflected the careful hospitality expected in a distinguished Victorian household. Eleanor welcomed the preparations with her usual quiet diligence, believing only that another guest would bring pleasant conversation for the children and perhaps cheerful memories for their employer. Lady Beatrice arrived one warm afternoon in an elegant carriage drawn by two fine horses and stepped gracefully onto the stone entrance, carrying herself with polished confidence earned through years among the highest circles of society. She greeted Henry with sincere warmth and expressed delight at seeing Ashwood Hall once more filled with life. At first, her manners toward Eleanor were perfectly courteous, and she thanked the young governess for the evident happiness she had brought to the children, whose confidence and laughter impressed every visitor. Yet Lady Beatrice possessed observant eyes that rarely overlooked the smallest detail. She noticed how Henry unconsciously searched the room whenever Eleanor was absent, and how his reserved expression softened the moment she entered carrying books or guiding the children through their lessons. She observed that Eleanor never sought his attention, yet seemed instinctively aware whenever he needed a quiet word or a peaceful moment beside the fire after a demanding day. None of these moments appeared improper, yet together they formed a quiet picture, impossible for an experienced observer to ignore. During several evenings, the household gathered in the drawing room, where music drifted gently from the piano and conversation flowed as softly as the summer breeze entering through the open windows. Lady Beatrice watched Henry listening to Eleanor describe a favorite poem with greater interest than he showed for discussions of politics or fashionable society. More than once she caught him smiling before he realized it himself. Eleanor remained modest and composed, treating Henry with the same respectful courtesy she had always shown, yet an unspoken warmth had grown between them that no careful discipline could entirely conceal. One evening, as candles flickered gently upon polished tables, Lady Beatrice stood alone beside the window, looking out across the moonlit gardens where Henry and Eleanor walked slowly, with the children gathering late-blooming roses. She said nothing, and her expression remained calm yet thoughtful, as though a difficult conclusion had quietly formed within her heart. Beyond the peaceful beauty of the estate, the first delicate threads of suspicion had begun to weave themselves together, and although Ashwood Hall still rested beneath tranquil summer skies and unseen, change had already begun to move silently through its ancient halls. The peaceful rhythm of Ashwood Hall continued through the gentle days of early summer, yet beneath its calm surface quiet tensions slowly began to grow. Lady Beatrice remained the picture of perfect courtesy, offering warm smiles to the children, speaking kindly with the servants, and expressing sincere admiration for the order that Eleanor had brought to the household. Nevertheless, her thoughtful eyes missed very little. She observed the smallest exchanges between Henry and Eleanor, the brief smiles that appeared without conscious effort, the comfortable silences that required no conversation, and the quiet understanding that seemed to exist. Even when they stood on opposite sides of the room, none of these moments could be called improper, yet together they suggested an affection far deeper than either of them intended to reveal. Eleanor herself remained unaware of how easily genuine kindness could be mistaken for something impossible to conceal. She continued her lessons, with calm devotion guiding the children through history, poetry, and music while encouraging them to become thoughtful and compassionate young people. Henry admired her more with every passing day, not because she sought admiration, but because she never did. He found himself looking forward to the simple moments when she entered the library carrying another well-loved book or paused in the gardens to admire the opening of a single rose. One warm evening, the household gathered for tea upon the terrace overlooking the western lawns where the setting sun painted the sky with gentle shades of amber and pale lavender. The children laughed as they chased butterflies across the grass while Eleanor remained nearby, sewing a loose ribbon onto the youngest girl's bonnet. Henry crossed the lawn carrying several books he had promised to lend her, and without thinking he selected one whose pages contained a pressed white flower collected many years before. As Eleanor accepted the volume, their hands touched, only for the briefest instant, yet both smiled with quiet warmth before returning their attention to the children. Lady Beatrice witnessed the small exchange from the terrace, and although nothing had been spoken, the tenderness between them became unmistakable in her eyes. Later that evening, she invited Henry to remain in the drawing room after the others had retired. Her voice remained gentle as she asked whether he had considered what people beyond the estate might think if they misunderstood the growing closeness between the master of the house and a young governess. Henry answered calmly that Eleanor had conducted herself with perfect dignity from the day she arrived and deserved nothing except gratitude and respect. Lady Beatrice nodded thoughtfully, yet warned him that society often judged appearances more harshly than truth. Her words lingered in the quiet room long after their conversation ended. Henry stood alone beside the dying fire, wondering whether happiness always demanded a price that revealed itself only when hope had finally begun to blossom. Upstairs, Eleanor looked from her bedroom window toward the peaceful gardens, believing the evening to be no different from countless others, unaware that beyond the comforting silence, the first serious shadow had already fallen across the future they had never dared to imagine aloud. The bright days of summer remained as beautiful as ever, yet Ashwood Hall no longer felt entirely untouched by quiet unease. The gardens still bloomed with fragrant roses, the children still laughed as they played beneath the ancient trees, and every evening the familiar fire glowed warmly inside the library, but an invisible distance had begun to settle over the household, like a faint morning mist. Eleanor noticed little changes that seemed too small to question. Lady Beatrice now attended nearly every lesson with polite interest, asking thoughtful questions about the children's education while watching every expression that passed between the governess and their father. Her smile never disappeared and her words remained perfectly gracious, yet Eleanor often sensed that she herself was being quietly measured by standards she could not fully understand. Henry also felt the growing weight of careful observation. Whenever he and Eleanor happened to speak alone for even a few peaceful moments, someone seemed to appear nearby, whether by intention or simple coincidence. The easy comfort they had once shared became touched by hesitation, not because either wished it, but because both understood that the customs of their world allowed very little freedom to hearts that belonged to different stations in life. One evening, after the children had retired, Lady Beatrice once again asked Henry to remain in the drawing room where the last light of sunset faded. Beyond the tall windows, she spoke gently of reputation, of family honor, and of the future awaiting the young heirs of Ashwood Hall. She reminded him that every decision made by the master of such an estate would soon become the subject of conversation among neighbors, relatives, and society itself. She never criticized Eleanor's character, and even praised her intelligence, kindness, and devotion, but quietly insisted that affection alone could never silence the judgments of the world. Henry listened without interruption, though every word seemed to weigh heavily upon his heart. He answered that true dignity belonged not to titles or fortunes, but to honesty, compassion and courage. Lady Beatrice lowered her eyes and replied that the world rarely rewarded such noble beliefs. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat alone in the library after finishing the children's lessons, arranging well-worn books upon their shelves while the fire burned softly beside her. The room that had once brought only comfort now seemed strangely quiet, as though even the familiar walls sensed a change approaching. She wondered whether she had unknowingly disappointed someone within the household, yet no answer came to ease her thoughts. When Henry entered a few moments later, they exchanged only a gentle greeting and spoke briefly about the children's progress before silence settled once more between them. Their eyes met for only an instant, yet in that quiet glance both recognized the same unspoken concern. Neither wished to burden the other with fears that could not yet be named. Outside the windows, the summer night spread peacefully across the sleeping estate, while inside Ashwood Hall the first fragile cracks had begun to appear beneath the calm surface of a happiness that had once seemed as steady as the fire glowing faithfully upon the hearth. The peaceful days of late summer seemed almost too beautiful to last, as though nature itself wished to offer one final season of quiet happiness before change arrived. The gardens overflowed with blooming roses and climbing ivy, while warm evening light rested upon the ancient stones of Ashwood Hall with gentle golden splendor. Eleanor continued her lessons with the same patience and kindness that had transformed the household during the past months, and the children had grown so deeply attached to her that they eagerly shared every new discovery, every dream, and every small triumph with the gentle governess who had become the steady heart of their daily lives. Henry watched these moments with quiet gratitude, knowing that no amount of wealth could have purchased the peace she had restored to his family. Yet beneath the calm rhythm of the estate, another current quietly gathered strength. Lady Beatrice had become convinced that what she observed was no passing admiration, but the beginning of a love that neither Henry nor Eleanor any longer possessed the strength to hide from themselves. She believed she acted out of loyalty to Henry and to the honor of his household, although her growing determination left little room for compassion. One cool evening after the children had gone to bed, Eleanor entered the library to return several books to their familiar shelves. The fire burned gently despite the mild weather, casting a warm glow across the polished wood and the countless volumes that lined the walls. From floor to ceiling, Henry was already there, standing beside the window where the last colors of sunset faded beyond the gardens. For several quiet moments, they simply admired the peaceful evening before. Henry spoke with unusual honesty. He thanked Eleanor for bringing joy back into a house that had forgotten how to smile, and confessed that every day had become brighter because of her calm presence. Eleanor lowered her eyes, unable to hide the emotion in her gentle expression, and softly admitted that Ashwood Hall had become more than a place of work, because within its walls she had discovered kindness, friendship, and a happiness she had never expected to find. Neither reached for the other, yet the affection between them filled the silent room more clearly than any spoken declaration ever could. Unseen beyond the half-open doorway, Lady Beatrice had paused while passing along the corridor and heard enough of their quiet conversation to confirm every suspicion she had carried for weeks. She stepped away without making a sound, her face composed but deeply troubled. In her mind, the matter could no longer be ignored. Before the next day had ended, she resolved that Henry must choose between his growing affection and the expectations placed upon the master of Ashwood Hall. Inside the library, Henry and Eleanor remained unaware that the peaceful sanctuary they had shared for so many evenings had just witnessed the final moment of calm before the gentle world they had built together would begin to unravel beneath the weight of society, duty, and impossible expectations. Morning arrived beneath a sky veiled with quiet gray clouds, and the cheerful songs of birds seemed strangely distant, as though even the gardens sensed the heaviness that had settled over Ashwood Hall. Eleanor began her lessons, as she always had, with calm patience, never imagining that every familiar room she crossed might soon belong only to memory. The children noticed that Henry appeared unusually thoughtful during breakfast, and that Lady Beatrice spoke very little despite her customary grace. The silence lingering around the table felt unfamiliar, and every gentle sound of silver against porcelain seemed louder than before. After the lessons had ended, Lady Beatrice requested a private conversation with Henry in his study. She spoke without anger, yet with unwavering certainty. She reminded him that the master of Ashwood Hall carried responsibilities extending far beyond his own happiness. She insisted that affection for a governess would become a source of endless gossip, damaging not only his own standing but also the future of his children, whose lives would forever be shaped by the opinions of society. Henry answered that Eleanor possessed greater dignity than many ladies welcomed into the finest drawing rooms of England, and that her kindness had restored hope to a grieving family. Lady Beatrice acknowledged every admirable quality Eleanor possessed, yet quietly declared that society would never judge her by virtue alone. She urged Henry to end the attachment before it brought greater sorrow to them both. The conversation lasted long into the afternoon, until at last Henry lowered his head in painful silence. His heart resisted every argument, yet years of duty and habit weighed heavily upon his decision. Lady Beatrice gently suggested that Eleanor should leave the estate while her reputation remained untouched, and before rumors found their way beyond the manor walls. When the housekeeper was instructed to deliver the news, her own eyes filled with quiet sadness, for she had grown deeply fond of the gentle governess who had changed the spirit of the household. Eleanor listened without interruption as she was told that her services would no longer be required after the following morning, and that generous references would be provided for any future position. She thanked the housekeeper with remarkable composure, though her hands trembled ever so slightly as she folded them before her. She asked no questions and offered no complaint, because she already understood more than anyone had spoken aloud. That evening she quietly packed her few belongings, placing each well-worn book, each carefully folded dress, and each precious keepsake into a modest traveling case. The children sensed that something was terribly wrong and clung to her with tearful confusion, while she comforted them with gentle smiles that hid the ache within her own heart. Outside the windows, the first drops of rain began to fall across the gardens, where so many peaceful memories had been born. Inside the library, the fire still burned softly upon the hearth, yet for the first time since Eleanor had arrived, its comforting warmth could not protect the quiet happiness that was slipping away with the coming dawn. Dawn arrived beneath a quiet gray sky as gentle rain drifted across the gardens of Ashwood Hall, covering every flower and every ancient stone with a delicate silver mist. Eleanor rose before the rest of the household and carefully closed the modest traveling case that held everything she possessed. Before leaving her room, she paused beside the window for one final look across the peaceful estate, where she had found friendship, kindness, and a happiness she had never expected to know. The familiar paths through the gardens, the library windows glowing softly in the early light, and the old oak trees standing faithfully beyond the lawns seemed almost to bid her farewell. Downstairs, the servants waited silently in the entrance hall. The elderly housekeeper embraced Eleanor with quiet affection, while several of the younger maids struggled to hide their tears. During the months she had spent at Ashwood Hall, she had become part of the gentle rhythm of the house, and no one could imagine the rooms feeling quite the same without her calm presence. The children came running before breakfast, still wrapped in warm robes, and threw their arms around her, refusing to believe that she truly had to leave. Eleanor knelt beside them, speaking softly of courage, learning, and the quiet strength that kind hearts carried wherever life might lead them. She promised that every story they had read together and every walk through the gardens would remain among the happiest memories of her life. The youngest child slipped a tiny pressed wildflower into her hand, whispering that she must never forget them. Eleanor held back her tears and kissed each child gently before rising to leave. Beyond the great oak door, the carriage stood, waiting patiently beneath the light rain. Unknown to everyone below, Henry remained alone inside the library, where the fire still burned faintly from the previous evening. He stood motionless beside the window, unable to gather the courage to descend the staircase. Every instinct urged him to stop her, yet years of discipline, duty, and fear of bringing scandal upon his children held him where he stood. He watched through the rain-streaked glass as the carriage slowly crossed the courtyard. Eleanor never looked toward the library because she believed he had chosen not to say goodbye. The horses passed beneath the ancient gates and disappeared along the winding road until only silence remained. It was not until the sound of the wheels had completely faded that Henry finally left the library and walked into the empty entrance hall. The house seemed strangely hollow, as though every room had lost its warmth in a single morning. He wandered back to the library, where one of Eleanor's favorite books still rested upon the small table beside the fireplace, with a ribbon marking the final page she had read. Henry gently lifted the book into his hands and understood with quiet certainty that in choosing duty over his own heart he had not protected his home at all. He had only allowed the person who had restored its happiness to walk away without ever knowing how deeply she had been loved. Autumn returned to the English countryside before Henry Ashcroft finally understood that time alone could not silence the emptiness left by Eleanor's departure. The leaves once again turned to shades of amber and gold, and the evenings grew longer around the familiar fireplace in the library, yet Ashwood Hall had become as quiet as it had been before she first crossed its threshold. The children often asked whether Miss Hart might ever return, and even the servants spoke of her with gentle affection as though she had been a cherished member of the family rather than an employee. Henry fulfilled every duty expected of him with unwavering diligence, yet each success seemed strangely hollow because there was no longer anyone with whom he wished to share the simple joys of an ordinary day. Lady Beatrice remained at the estate only a short while after Eleanor's departure, but before leaving she witnessed the sorrow that had settled over every room of the house. She realized with growing regret that she had mistaken social expectation for wisdom and had protected a reputation while wounding the very people she wished to spare. On the morning of her departure, she quietly handed Henry a folded piece of paper containing the address of the small village where Eleanor had accepted another position. She confessed that it had been her insistence which persuaded him to dismiss her and asked only that if he still loved her, he should never again allow fear to speak louder than his own heart. Henry kept the paper untouched for several days, not because he doubted his feelings, but because he wished to be certain that he was acting from conviction rather than loneliness. When at last he departed Ashwood Hall, it was with the calm determination of a man who had chosen the course of the rest of his life. Eleanor had found employment in the home of a quiet country clergyman, where her kindness was valued as deeply as it had been at Ashwood Hall. She was surprised one peaceful afternoon when the maid announced that a gentleman had come, requesting the honor of speaking with her. Henry waited in the modest garden beneath an old apple tree, whose branches had begun to lose their autumn leaves. Neither hurried toward the other because months of separation had taught them the value of every quiet moment. Henry spoke first and admitted that no opinion of society could ever outweigh a lifetime spent without the woman he loved. He asked not for forgiveness, but for the privilege of building a future together, if she still believed such happiness possible. Tears shone gently in Eleanor's eyes as she answered that her heart had never truly left Ashwood Hall. Their marriage took place quietly the following spring in the village church, attended by the children, the faithful servants, and a humbled Lady Beatrice, whose sincere blessing meant more than any fashionable approval. Some neighbors whispered for a season, yet gossip faded far sooner than kindness. Ashwood Hall slowly became the warm home it had always longed to be, where books, laughter, music, and peaceful evenings beside the glowing fire filled every passing year. And if this gentle Victorian tale has brought you comfort beside the fireplace, please subscribe for more Victorian-era stories by the fireside, where every quiet evening begins with the glow of warm embers and another timeless story waiting to be told.